Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sophia Gruskin, and I direct the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health. I'm extremely excited to have Erin here with us. And let me say a few things about her, if I may, before we begin.
Dangerous.
Very dangerous, all right? So she's the Director of Olympic and Paralympic Development in the Office of the Mayor of Los Angeles, Erin Garcetti. But most importantly for our discussion today, she's the Conrad Hilton Foundation Fellow on the Sustainable Development Goals. And she leads this initiative for the Mayor's Office on behalf of the residents of LA, with a focus on moving beyond simply adopting the SDG goals at the city level towards actually what does implementation actually look like. And she works with local communities in terms of actually trying to make those targets and those indicators something real. Now here's the very cool thing, if I may say, which is that we have been working with and supporting her office in this work for the last several years, including as members of the Academic Advisory Council. And we had a practicum here about a year ago where we brought in students from across the university. And this summer, we're going to be co-organizing an SDG Student Leadership Academy to support the city in some very practical ways. See the note up here. So if you're interested, please do let us know by filling out the interest form. The focus on practicality is something that I actually want to emphasize in terms of Erin and the way in which she thinks about and engages with the SDGs in ways that I think matter a lot. And Erin, I'm going to pull out a quote of yours that Shervin was able to find.
Are we sure this was on the record?
I definitely want it on the record. You may or may not, but I thought it was pretty great. So the goal of any major city right now should be to think about what they want in 10, 15 years so that they can be future guiding, as opposed to future passive or future phobic.
Mm-hmm. I stole that from the mayor, by the way. So.
Is that right?
It is.
All
yeah.
right, it's an
100%.
excellent thing.
So yeah.
The future will come. So having stolen that from the mayor, you did an excellent job.
Thank you.
It sounded very much like it was like your own words. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. Erin has basically said that she's going to speak about 30 minutes and leave plenty of time for question and discussion. And so with that, Erin, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Okay? And join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Sophia. All right, we're going to switch over to my slides. So first, let me say thank you for being here. Thank you for having an interest in this subject. Thank you to Sophia for hosting, and to the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health for being such a key partner of the city for the last couple of years. Thank you to Angela, who is my partner in all things SDG at the city. So if you have any questions, particularly about the data side of the house, feel free to engage with Angela afterwards. And thank you to all the folks who've been a part of this, including our entire academic council. That includes Occidental, UCLA, and as well as Arizona State University and the Thunderbird School there. And we're starting to add additional partners, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So I'll go through these slides, but I want not just your questions, but your ideas as well. So if you have anything that you think we should be doing or any ideas or suggestions, please feel free to make those at the end. Oh, I'm turning the wrong slides there. Okay, so hopefully if you're here, you're probably familiar with this color grid already. Right? This is the SDGs as adopted by the United Nations and the 193 member states in 2015. So these 17 are what we embrace. A lot of folks, when they started out thinking about the SDGs in cities, they really assumed that we would be engaged in SDG 11, which we are. On a daily basis, those are the things the city does. We provide key city services. But those city services can't be divorced from all of these other factors that weigh into how we think about sustainable development in the city. So why would we try to take this on? Like, why would we do this in LA? And the truth is, it started in a couple different ways. It started in early 2017. Ed Kane, who was formerly a vice president of the Hilton Foundation, which is based up in Westlake, Agoura Hills area, he had been really engaged in the UN for most of his career and felt like the SDGs really represented kind of a culmination. We'd previously seen the UN kind of iterate. You had the compact on this and the convention on this, and the MDGs were finally this first attempt with the Millennium Development Goals to put together a shared agenda. And then the SDGs became a much more well-socialized and kind of community input-driven expansion and improvement on the MDGs. And so he felt like the SDGs were this big culmination of an opportunity. The timing was just somewhat bad for the US, right? They passed in September of 2015 to go into effect in early 2016. We had an election in late 2016 where signs pointed to the fact that we were not going to be, as a nation, heavily engaged in the UN, let alone the SDGs. So we thought it was an opportunity, and Ed thought it was an opportunity to see what else could be done. And so he spoke with the mayor and he spoke with the CEO of Hilton, Peter Larn, about implementing the SDGs locally. What would it look like if a city took this on, and could Hilton help support that? And so they did. And the mayor has said this, again, I use his quotes primarily, right? That's how we're trained. I think it's really an important one. Like, why would we do something that the UN signed on to? Like, we are not member of the UN. That is the national government, the federal government. In our construct, no one from the State Department calls and says, hey, what are you guys doing on this? Should we check in and make sure it's working? So why would a city take this on? And the answer is because sustainable development is not just something that happens in other places, right? That was kind of more of a construct that people had mentally around the MDGs, is like development is international development is something we pay for, but not something we do. And I think that that's not the case, right? Development here is just as important as development anywhere, and to do it sustainably means that it'll last, it'll endure, and it'll hopefully be equitable in the process. So these are the reasons that we came to in terms of why we explain why we're engaged, right? LA is a global city. 224 different languages spoken here, hundreds, dozens at least of diaspora communities. Sometimes we're the largest collective of a community outside of a home country in LA. So we're incredibly diverse. We are a global city, and we want to be a part of the global community and part of this shared agenda. It also helps, like using this shared framework helps us to see where our projects are or are not in line with what everyone else is doing globally in terms of sustainable development. And they also give us a common language. And it's amazing how effective that language has and can be, and I'll talk more about that in future slides. It also gives us, with the robustness of the SDG framework, not just 17 goals, but 169 targets, 240 plus indicators, by which we can actually bring in our own data, evaluate, measure our progress, and track advancement towards these goals. And we do that in a way that holds ourselves accountable and is transparent to the public. So that last slide says from alignment to action, and that's what I'll start talking about here. As we started, as I'll get to in a little bit, just to try to understand where we already sat vis-a-vis the goals. And we did that thanks to support from the Hilton Foundation, like I talked about, as well as our Mayor's Fund for Los Angeles, the Mayor's Office, and all the city departments. We then also very quickly brought in a series of academic partners, recognizing the incredible talent that exists within the community here in LA from an academic university standpoint, and also the potential to work with students as force multipliers for some of this, right? Capacity building through the university partnerships. And then we've worked quite a bit with Brookings, which is based in Washington and leads an SDG Leadership Cities Coalition, as well as the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is based in New York. It has kind of a number of different thematic networks. We've worked most closely with their USA Cities initiative, as well as with the data team, which is the thematic research network on data and statistics. But more than anything, we've worked with students. And so this is just a subset of some of them, and you'll see people on this slide who are in this room today. I'm pointing to Gaia over there. I was hoping Pascal could come too, but he's up there. So we've had a tremendous amount of students who have worked with us. I think if we count the kind of semester-long classes, we're over 80 students that have been engaged in this project over the last 2 years. These students represent the cohort that was dedicated to working with us through the summer of 2018. And as Sophia mentioned, we're reconvening a cohort for the summer of 2020. And we're getting into a little bit of a cycle here where 2018, we have a bunch of students engaged. They did a bunch of research that we were then able to kind of take back to the city and digest and validate, and then translate that into reporting that we used as part of our 2019 voluntary local review to the UN. We're going to do the same thing, 2020, make it about a lot of research, engagement, bring that back, understand progress, validate those findings with our policy cohort in the city, and then report on that hopefully in a really robust way in 2021. So how did we do it? What does implementation look like? So this comes from kind of a more traditional management consulting methodology that I brought to the table after 15 years working in federal government. And it really started with the first step is a kind of current state analysis. Like, where are we? Like, here are these 17 goals, 169 targets. How does that marry up with what the city's already doing? And so the first exercise, which we did really for the first 6 to 8 months, was just understanding that alignment. How did we map ourselves to the goals and vice versa? The second was to look and see where we had any sort of gaps. So like, where are there things that are missing? So when we did an initial budget mapping of where the city's budget aligns to the goals, we saw that there were a couple of things that were completely absent. There were things you would expect, like we were heavily in SDG 16 because LAPD's budget is a big part of the city budget. That becomes a part of peace, justice, and strong institutions. But we were missing things like gender equity is a huge priority for us, but we don't have a lot of explicit line items that call out gender equity programming, right? So there were things that we had to kind of go back and understand whether it was an absence of evidence or evidence of absence and try to assign some meaning to this gap assessment. We then also looked at localization. So how do we understand what the SDG framework looks like in the context of Los Angeles? And we did that with a lot of student support. Gay was a part of the cohort that actually made recommendations on how to revise the targets for us. And the target language was revised really along one of three ways, excuse me. The first was to look at, is the numerical measure of the target accurate for Los Angeles? So in some cases, the target will say 70,000 per 100,000, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. We're way better than that already. So do we need to revise the target or figure out a different way of understanding the context for that particular measure? The second was it was not necessarily representative of our city in terms of how we identify ourselves. So explicitly, the goals and the target language says things like girls and boys, men and women. We wanted to degender that language and make it all children, all people. That was a big step for us, adding our particular context for the city. And then the third category were just places where the city's authority or jurisdiction isn't quite accurate, or we had to insert local and community as opposed to national and regional or international and national. And so there was just kind of a contextualization of the language that we did really from a top-down perspective in localization. And now we're in what we call phase 4, which is mobilization. And this is the real question is now that we've done all this foundational work to understand where we sit vis-a-vis the goals, where we have gaps, where we could improve, how do we actually use that common language to bring us together, both in partnership with folks around the world who are doing similar work, either in cities or elsewhere, and also locally? How do we talk to our own multi-sector partners in the nonprofit space and the private sector and understand if they're invested or interested in trying to accelerate progress towards the goals around these particular targets or initiatives using that common language? Excuse me. So I mentioned we did the target localization really kind of from the top down. Can we fix the language? From the indicator side, and this is going into the data piece, we started looking at where we have data. So first we were interested in really, do we have lagging or leading indicators? Like what do the indicators tell us? So some of the indicators track outcomes, right? And a lot of that is very fixed, right? That's a very lagging indicator. We wanted to, in the process, start developing leading indicators to complement it. So again, because we're not a member state to the UN, we didn't sign the declaration. We've just committed ourselves to the shared agenda. We see a really clear opportunity to insert ourselves into this and make it work for the city of Los Angeles. And in doing that, that means creating our own indicators that can speak to specific measures that we value. So if we think about that target localization, how we added language or numbers or geographic indicators that made it work for LA, we also want to do that from the bottom up and actually source data and source ways of measuring and evaluating our progress that speak to our community. And that may mean, instead of just measuring how many people have died, we're actually measuring how many people have sought treatment or sought help, right? So we're trying to get ahead of the problem. And the reason that we do that is because we need this to take action. In order to turn this into an action agenda and not just a measurement agenda, we have to know where policy interventions can make a difference. And if we only know where people are dying, we have the ability to understand the problem, but we don't have the ability to understand how to help. And so that's where the data becomes a really key part for us, sourcing this information and context about the community that then enables us to take policy action. Excuse me. So real fast, to talk about monitoring progress and reporting. There's a little bit of a zeitgeist among the community of cities that have started this work, and that is to actually try to create space for cities to report directly to the United Nations in this space. This is a part of a larger conversation around city diplomacy that really talks to what is the role for cities in the multilateral context that we've built, right? So what is the role of cities at the UN? Is it incumbent on the federal government to solicit and create space for their major cities to input to the agenda? Or is there a way for cities to speak directly? Or are there intermediaries, regional associations, other types of groups that effectively serve as a voice for cities? This is a very active conversation that's underway right now. Our team in the Mayor's Office of International Affairs has been really engaged with the Annenberg Center on Public Diplomacy here at USC to foster a lot of those conversations around city diplomacy and what it means, where it's going. And I think I expect to be kind of actively engaged in that in the future as we start talking about what that means in the multilateral context. But it's very much an interesting place to be, and the SDGs have been a part of bringing that conversation to the fore because we care about these issues. Cities have a role to play in setting policy on things like these transnational issues like climate and like migration. So how do we actually weigh into some of these policymaking and deliberative bodies in a less than ad hoc way, like in a more deliberate way? And so VLRs have kind of become a tool to demonstrate that we're there. They're kind of an ante up on the table that says like, hey, cities are doing this too. We're not just SDG 11, right? Like we care about more than that. And so member states report regularly in what's called the Voluntary National Review Construct. That's a part of their obligations that they signed as they signed on to the declaration. But cities have started to step up as well. So we were the 6th city as part of the first cohort really in last summer in 2019. New York was the first in 2018. And as host to the UN, they had kind of had the imprimatur to do that, really get that ball rolling. And they played a really key role in accelerating other cities to join in. So we became the 6th city in the world to do it, along with Mannheim, Helsinki, Buenos Aires, a couple other major cities, all of whom have become a part of our kind of cohort of SDG leadership cities. And as of, I think, this summer, more than 38 cities have agreed to submit in 2020 or 2021. So this is definitely a quickly growing, really accelerating a lot of cities getting involved in this space. And that's really bringing to the fore kind of a conversation around what does that look like? What does it need to look like? What are the tools that are accessible to cities? Like, how do we be a part of this conversation? And so in 2020, as you're aware, we're entering the 75th anniversary of the UN. We're also in the first year of the Decade of Action, 10 years left to go on the SDGs. So as we start this Decade of Action, 51 member states have agreed to submit during the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, which will be July in New York. And we're hoping that at some point in that construct, there will also be space for cities to show up, at least some of the 38 cities that have or will report this year. So I think it's going to create a lot of interesting conversation. And if you're interested in this space, feel free to talk to me after. I won't go into the city diplomacy hole right now, but it's definitely something to watch. So as I mentioned, we're working closely with 16 other global cities as part of the Brookings SDG Leadership Cities Cohort to really build out the tools and enablers that help more governments come online to do this, regardless of whether you're a local, regional, national government. So some of what we found in our SDG data reporting, as I mentioned, we are building these tools, and some of these things, we do all of this in a very open source way, in a transparent way, so that anybody could copy us, reach out to us, steal the work that we've done and repurpose it for their own use, right? It's something we'd love to see, right? Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? So one of the things that we've really found is, as we've reported on 136 of the 240 indicators right now, which I would mention is about 37 more than the US government is currently reporting on, we found that there's a real importance to being able to disaggregate that data. So to truly embrace the mantra of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is to leave no one behind in this process of development, we really need to disaggregate and understand both demographically and geographically who is not keeping up with the progress that we're reporting on. I'd also say we're working with an open source platform. We built that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But that's really been a tool through GitHub and other online repositories to actually engage with cities as well as national governments. So originally, the platform that we work on was built by the US and the UK government together. The UK government then went on to build copies of that through foreign aid programs with Armenia and Kyrgyzstan and has started to roll that out. The US government hasn't done much with theirs. So we stepped in and actually took it and customized some of the code so it could reflect the local context. And we're now working to kind of extrapolate that out to other cities. The UK has now stepped in, realized that that was value, and they're working to use our platform, our local platform, with 13 cities in the UK. So this is a real growing community of folks who are doing this type of work in terms of trying to visualize the data. And that's where we talk here. SDG 3.11 is one of my favorite SDGs. We talk about maternal mortality with this SDG. The goal is really how do you reduce maternal mortality to below 70 per 100,000, which is the global target. It's a perfect example for us of where we are better than 70 per 100,000 unless you're an African American woman, right? At which point you're really close to actually that global target. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge that we know is actually when we disaggregate by educational background, geography, median income, it doesn't actually matter, right? It's really based on this systemic racism that is in our healthcare system that is making it so much more dangerous to be a Black mom giving birth than anyone else in this city, county, state, and country, because it holds across all of those various geographic breakdowns. So some of the things that we then look at when we know that this disaggregation exists, when we disaggregate and we see completely disparate challenges within the data, is what are the factors that are causing that? How, again, do we understand, based on that disaggregation, where we can actually create policy steps to take action on this? So we look at issues of discrimination, geography, governance, socioeconomic status, and then shocks and fragility in the system itself. And so these are things where when you actually start doing this work, it goes very quickly from we believe in good health and well-being, SDG 3, we're going to commit to good health and well-being, to if you're serious about it, if you're really doing the work, implementation gets into this, right? Where you have 240 plus different ways, and no, by the way, if you disaggregate, you have a bunch of different factors, so you're starting into multiples, right? You need to plow through this and really understand what it says about whether you're leaving no one behind. So rather than just declare victory and be like, well, at the county level or at LA City level, we're better than 70 per 100,000, so we got that one done, check, we're good, right? It really requires you to dig in and understand if that's true. And that's where the leave no one behind agenda becomes a really important driving factor beyond just the initial kind of push to achieve some of these target and kind of target numbers. So I mentioned the open source data reporting piece. So I've talked already a little bit about this, but suffice it to say, like, we think that the open source technology it's a key edict, key value, if you will, of how we're going to do this work going forward, both from the quantitative side when we talk about our data reporting platform, but also from the qualitative side. So as soon as we have findings or work that we've done on a particular project, we intend to publish that, put it out there, share it. We've done that already with a number of briefs that we've created on the localization, the revision of the language, like I mentioned. But also we plan to do that really extensively this summer. We did that with our voluntary local review last summer, and we'll do it again with some voluntary local reporting this summer. So I mentioned the GitHub piece. It not only allows us to kind of make it publicly available, but it allows for an exchange of information to customize that code. So some of the things that we've been able to contribute is the way that the page looks and feels, and some of the key functionality was actually built by student developers who were interns in our office. They did that, they put it on GitHub, and now it's been adopted by the German government, right? So there's a real chance to impact from this perch here in LA, this global conversation, as well as these global tools and enablers. Phase 4 was mobilization, and mobilization is what we care about the most. We think it will demonstrate the value add, right? So we could do all of this work, and we could do all of this work and put it out there, and maybe you start a conversation, maybe you just have a better sense for where policies are or are not. But until we're actually trying to use that work to accelerate progress to actually meet the SDGs and try to achieve those targets, it's kind of for naught. So we have 3 projects underway right now that I'll talk about as part of this slide. And these are 3 of many more projects that we have. But the first is that we've started to talk about in this decade of action, starting in 2020, how we can pull out and create unique models of multi-sector partnerships using the SDG language that creates a type of accelerator. In our case, we're focusing right now on housing, and more specifically, we're narrowing that down to look at housing prevention and the impact of emerging technology. So we have a planning grant from a philanthropy to look at how we can introduce 4th industrial revolution technologies like big data, machine learning, other types of vectors there, to actually help support some of our key prevention initiatives in housing and housing affordability. Meaning, how do we keep people in their own homes? Or how do we allow them to find resources quickly so that if they do experience a transition in housing, they're quickly rehoused, right? So what are things that we can do in that space, and how can we bring together the tech community as well as the service providers and folks that are working in housing, as well as those with lived experience, to really inform the creation of new projects or new scalable initiatives that reflect the intent of SDGs and SDG 11.1 in particular. Sophia mentioned, and I mentioned the summer cohort this summer. Second time we're going to do it, it's going to look a little different than it did in 2018 because we're in a little bit different space. But we have how many projects, Angela, right now? I think 9 projects, all of which are focused on a different SDG. And they range from things like looking at economic immobility issues in SDG 1, which is one I'll be personally involved in this summer, as well as I think you're going to be involved in that, a couple other folks. All the way to looking at biodiversity using iNaturalist data, which is citizen-reported data, and how we can identify which species are transient in and out of particular habitats that are rapidly developing within LA City. That's in partnership with LA Bureau of Sanitation and the Environment. And so in all cases, these 9 projects that Sophia mentioned that you all could be a part of are actually all rooted in projects that the city needs help with. So every one of them has a city sponsor, so to speak, or a client. And that city team will be working with the student group over the course of the summer to really vector that into policy recommendations or data outcomes that help advance the conversation. The last one I'll mention is something that you'll see come out in the next month. So we've come together with a group of 6 other founding cities, and we're going to launch an international gender equity network of cities. This work is going to be focused on, for the first year, compiling a set of where cities have unique levers or unique authorities that allow them to take immediate systemic change related to gender equity initiatives. So in our particular case, I would point to the ability that we don't control kind of all of the civil service, but we do control appointed positions. So within the first 6 months, the mayor was able to make all boards and commissions in the city have gender parity across all those boards and commissions. That's an example of something that, depending on your context, you can take immediate steps at the local level to do. And there are many, many more examples of things that we've done that are much more deliberate than that speak to achieving gender equity across the city, kind of the city space. And that's what we want to build, kind of a repository of case studies, actions, and a toolkit with these other co-founding cities, and then broaden that out to be a real global initiative. So we'll be launching that officially on Women's Day, which is on Sunday, International Women's Day, this coming Sunday, with an event at the end of the month. So 2020 plan of action, like where are we going from here? I mentioned we're continuing to revise our data platform and add data, generate insights from that data, try to do kind of, as I mentioned, as you have all of this qualitative reporting in terms of what is the city doing that we gathered through this mapping and alignment work, and then we have all this data sourcing. What does it actually tell us? And what kind of insights can we draw? And then as we dig into specific targets or indicators, when we disaggregate that data, like I showed you with 311, what does that tell us? And what actions can we take? So it kind of is a constant evolution, iteration, if you will, of trying to understand more, generating those insights, bringing in the policy experts who actually work or own this space, and figuring out if there's space where we can accelerate progress. So how can we bring together those unique coalitions to really try to accelerate action? That goes back to that phase 4 conversation. We're actually talking right now too about a voluntary local review for this summer. What we're interested in, and this is a little bit in the weeds, but as I mentioned, all those 38 cities are now working towards a VLR, have committed themselves to that work. There's a little bit of a push by the UN and by others to standardize that, right? Oh, this is what a VLR looks like. This is what you need to do. And we have a little bit of a rebel streak, being LA, capital of creativity, that we would like to push back on that. We would like cities to be able to define more freely kind of what they want to report on, how they assign this into their local context, and get away from some sense that like the UN is grading our homework, right? That is not what this is about, right? This is about achieving the goals. And so if we can do that in a creative way, and if reporting looks completely different than some sort of digital PDF that sits on a shelf, all the better. And so we're incentivized this summer, Angela and I are talking about this all the time, about how we can try to get to a VLR that kind of pushes that conversation a little bit. And then stakeholder mapping and engagement continues. We're trying to, as we do this, actively bring in more information from the community so that our foundational mapping of qualitative work doesn't just reflect what the city's doing or city policy, but reflects kind of what stakeholders in the broader community are doing. So where are there nonprofits engaged in this space? Where are private sector actors leading their own initiatives? Where are there really great ideas that are happening in our community that help advance some of these goals? And they come out of all different places. So SDG 12.3 under responsible consumption and production deals with halving food waste. And there are some amazing private, nonprofit, non-public initiatives that are out there around food waste reduction and composting and repurposing. I mean, Food Not Bombs has been around forever, right? And they do that type of work all the time. So how can we bring those folks into the conversation and find ways to make them a part of this mobilization and this acceleration towards action? And then we're really engaged internationally, right? So being on the vanguard, being one of the first cities that's really done this work at this level of depth, we get a lot of phone calls and we want to be able to answer them, right? Our North Star is we're doing this to make life better for the residents of Los Angeles, right? But we also recognize that if we can make life better for the residents of other cities around the world, we have achieved that and are likely highly connected to LA already. So how can we share kind of the knowledge that we've built? How can we do that? And that's, again, goes back to those values of creating everything in an open source, transparent, and accountable way. And then we're trying to mobilize, right? There's only so long that you can continue to report on this without really being driven to action. And so a big part of where we're going in the next couple of years is really focus more discreetly on specific people and specific problems in specific places within Los Angeles. And that's where we think the true value of the goals is going to come and really showcase what we can do. That's it. So I'd encourage you to go to these websites. sdg.lamayor.org is more of the qualitative side where you can see our reporting, some information about the goals. sdgdata.lamayor.org is a live site where you'll see up to the minute, if you will, data reporting where you can see that disaggregation, what we've been able to source from a variety of places. You can click and explore how it maps out. In some cases, we've been able to create interactive maps that reflect data so you can see geographically where that data lives in a disaggregated way. And then like demographically or in some other disaggregations if you click on kind of sub-selections at the left. So I encourage you to look at both websites. I encourage you to join us. And right now, I'd encourage you to ask questions. So thanks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sofia Gonzalez. I'm a public health professional, and I love everyone in sickness and in health. And so I wanted to ask, do we have to be a student to join the SDG Leadership Academy? A student anywhere?
No, I would say not at all. We welcome everyone to come be a part of this conversation. We can talk maybe offline about which ways that you could be specifically engaged. So from the Leadership Academy perspective, from like an outside advisory position, like we'd love to have your support. From the summer cohort, typically what's happening is we have at this point 7 academic institutions that have invested their time and energy. We really want to make sure that we have faculty support for each of those 9 projects that Angela mentioned. We want those teams to be intra-institutional, right? So we'll have folks from Oxy working with folks from UCLA, working with folks from USC, to the extent that's possible, right? UCLA has their own calendar, right? Like they tend to be on a different schedule than everyone else. But for the most part, we want those teams to be kind of reflective of the variety of institutions, and then they'll have a city client. So to the extent that those teams are going to be kind of 10 weeks of dedicated work through the course of the summer, that might be easier fit for students, but we're open to others. And then I would say in terms of the work that we do through the rest of the year, like in the non-summer construct, we're actively thinking about how to build out kind of these advisory councils, whether we focus them on specific thematic areas or whether we bring them into kind of some of the existing structures that already exist in the city so that we're not duplicating any effort that happens. And I think that'll be kind of on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to express that I am committed to all goals. However, being a public health professional, number 3 and 13 are really my passion, and I tie in, so since I do nutrition education and physical activity promotion, and I do understand, the food waste and the food insecurity, and these are two issues that should not be coexisting. Because if we have food insecurity, then we shouldn't have food waste.
Right.
So that's part of the work that I do, and what you said about systemic racism happening in our healthcare system, absolutely. I have experienced that, being a person with lived experience in the mental health side, and as a public health professional, I understand that. And so every single day, just like Dr. King had dream. My dream is justice will be served on a plate of freedom.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate your commitment.
Yeah, I wanted to know if there was any surprises when you saw the way that the data shook out once you had it. Were there things that you really didn't expect?
There are, I think on an individual level, there have been data that even Angela, who goes through tons of data sets all the time, like where she'll send it to me and we'll be like, whoa. And that goes into a conversation of like, what does it mean? So in SDG 16, is it 16.3, 16.2? It's percentage of the prison population that is unsentenced, right? So basically folks that are being held either without bail or in some sort of due process, right? Pretrial detention. And I think the number was like 63%. That's ridiculous, right? Like, what is going on? So I think we really need to understand more about what those numbers tell us, right? So that's a lot of times what happens is that you get like a trigger number that you have to then figure out, what does that mean? Is that because of cash bail? Is that because they've been charged on lesser offenses and are being held, right? Like, what is happening, but why do we have such a huge percentage of our population being held pretrial detention? And what does that look like from a societal perspective in terms of the impact on our community, right? So being able to draw those kind of linkages back to some of the other targets in the space, I think is really interesting, right? And so we're really working, I think, a lot to try to assign some of that connectivity between the targets, not in a very rote perspective, but that's where focusing in on the leading indicators or the indicators that have strong centrality is the other word we've been using, is really of interest to us. And so one of the things that we've started to look at with our other international city cohort is, can we identify the indicators that have that stickiness, that centrality, where like if we could scope down from 244 to maybe 35, right, we could, as a collective, really actively track kind of the health of our cities. And what does that look like? We know something like 8.6, which deals with opportunity youth, which are folks ages 16 to 24 who are not in school or employed. Like, what does that number tell us about the overall health of the city? It's got a lot of connectivity to other indicators, right? It's connected to SDG 1 and 3 and 4 and 8 and 9 and so on and so forth. So how can we find some of those sticky indicators and really understand from a global scale, are these some of the measures of our greatest need? Like, are these our greatest challenges?
So it sounds so far that the partnerships that you've engaged with have been really central and key to identifying those links between all of the other goals. So kind of going along the lines of SDG 17 with partnerships, you also mentioned kind of the so far success of the network of partners of just cities.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you're aware of where you work with different other kind of sector-specific networks that are dedicated to accomplishing the goals. Like, are there, for example, in kind of the nonprofit sphere or the private sector, specific cohorts or networks that kind of mirror what you're doing as a cohort of cities to accelerate the goals?
It's a great question, and the answer is yes. I think both on a macro level and on a more local level. So at the macro level, you have something like the UN Global Compact, which is the alliance of corporations who have signed on to the 10 principles of good business, but also the Sustainable Development Goals. And so the UN Global Compact has national regions, and we're a part of the Global Compact USA network. We hosted an event with them on gender equity in December. So there's an opportunity there for us to locally engage folks who are already, through their companies or corporate kind of giving social responsibility or other initiatives, a part of the SDGs. So I think that that helps. I also think the Global Compact as a whole has pushed into this kind of tools and operational space a little bit. So there's something called the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, WBCSD, hosts a bunch of kind of case studies of where companies have succeeded in particular facets of achieving the goals. There's also something that the UN Foundation launched with the Global Compact 2 years ago now called the World Benchmarking Alliance. It's based in the Netherlands. And WBA is focused on establishing benchmarks for corporate America specific to the targets of the SDGs. So they've been working on one, and it's very much like it's a very open source of engagement. Like, they are actively talking to companies about what is realistic so they can establish the right measures for those. And their first is on gender equity and I think also on climate, so 5 and 13. And then I would say additionally, I was going to say something about the benchmarking piece. Anyway, so that's happening. Like I would say private sector, that's kind of what's happening. Nonprofit sector, there's a really active, the international development community is really active in this space. I would say that there is like a hard line in between a nonprofit that is in international development and a nonprofit that is local. And the international development nonprofits care a lot about the SDGs. They've often been tasked with understanding their position vis-a-vis the SDGs for grant funding, whether that's from international development aid or other types of grants. Locally, not so much. And so there's been a push. There's a website called sdgfunders.org. There's an SDG philanthropy initiative. And they've really been vested in trying to understand how to get nonprofits to think in these terms. Here's what I think. I think nonprofits, most of the time, are relatively small and committed to doing work on the ground on a daily basis. And so it really doesn't matter to them, right? So if you're doing something on food security, food insecurity, right? Like you're more focused on that than you are on like reporting out on some sort of set of SDGs, right? So I think it's difficult, and so if we really want to see that succeed at the local and community nonprofit level, I think we're going to need to help them build the tools or bring them into coalitions that exist with the city, and that's really what we're trying to do.
I'm wondering about data disaggregation, specifically in the context of the way that we think about race versus ethnicity in this country, and sort of, are you pulling from existing data sources? And I know, like for the census of the American community, certainly the categories that they identify for race in particular are pretty limited. They don't necessarily reflect like the broad range of ethnic groups, especially in a city like Los Angeles. So I was wondering how you're balancing like existing data sources that might have like a more limited view of that ethnic breakdown, or like how you're conducting your own research and like what conversations went into how to delineate those types of.
It's a great question. I'm going to let Angela answer part of it, but I'll just start by saying our first kind of mandate was to get as much data as we can, right? So places where you have rigorous data sources like ACS, American Community Survey, which is part of the census, those are good quality data sets. They are not necessarily the way that we would capture identity across a variety of spectrums, including gender identity, including sexual orientation, including all kinds of disaggregations that we do not necessarily reflect in ACS. So I think that there's room for improvement, but we also want to do that kind of in comparison to a data set that already exists, not necessarily say like, well, we don't like how they define identity, so we're not going to evaluate this, or we're not going to disaggregate it worse, because the information that we get from disaggregation is not necessarily, it is still really valuable. Like it's still really important to understand why African Americans are at a much higher poverty level across our city, or experience housing insecurity at a much greater level, right? So like how can we try to understand those numbers? And if we didn't have the disaggregation, it would make for a much rosier picture. But, and I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
No, that was pretty good. But
Okay.
we use the ACS for about planning awareness, and we use the breakdowns that they have. And for different data sources, we use the breakdowns that they use. So we're not defining anything in our platform. We're just the data providers in Google.
So I'll point to like, we have, this is SDG 11, 11.2, right? 11.2 is not an official indicator, right? It's not a UN sanctioned indicator. It's one that we've added. And it deals with looking at rent burden and change in rent across, right? And this is one case where we actually have, thanks to volunteers, right? So data angels, folks from outside the city who built this data set using Zillow data. We were able to then say like, great work, we're gonna put it on our site, which we did, and Angela uploaded it to this site. So you can see actually kind of how the map looks in terms of monthly rent. You've got multi-year data, you've got differentials, and you've got all these other subcategories, right? So this type of work, right, really helps. It is based on ACS data because, again, data available is better than no data. But there's definitely room for improvement on a lot of these. But this is an example where like this does not exist on anyone else's SDG tracker, if you will, right? But how, like if we just looked at 11.1, proportion of urban population living in slums and formal settlements or inadequate housing, well, we could define that a lot of different ways, and it gives us a fixed number. So in order to get from that to something that we can take action on, right, we look at things like median rent or rent burden, right? So if 600,000 people in our city, and this is a true statistic, are experiencing 90% or greater of their income in rent, like that is a problem. Like, how do we actually figure out how to take action on things that are specific manifestations of the problem, not just on the total?
Thank you very much for excellent talk. I have to say, where have you been? Because this is excellent. Thank you, Sophia.
Thanks.
I'm a student of SDG and all of that, covered that in some of my classes. I have two quick questions. One question is, how many other cities in the United States are doing the same thing that you're doing for LA? Do they have SDG component in the mayor's office or municipality? That's my first question.
Okay. So to answer that, domestically, there I would say are about 5 cities who are doing this work rigorously. And I would say a lot of them, again, going back to this kind of bigger conversation around city diplomacy, a lot of them establish their roots in either a chief sustainability officer or a chief resiliency officer based on the 100 Resilient Cities program that was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, which ended last year. So those 100 resilient cities had to come up with a lot of resiliency planning as part of the mandate for that program, and that had a lot of connectivity to the goals. And so it was an easy jump for some of those cities to then add another kind of metric around the SDGs. If they'd already done a climate plan, they've already done a resiliency plan, then this became like kind of a logical balance with the human social dimension. So the 5 cities that we work with most are New York, Orlando, Pittsburgh, Houston. Interesting subset of cities. Pittsburgh is actually doing quite a bit of really good work. I would say they have, other than us, obviously, probably the most unique kind of team that they've built, and that is because they've got Carnegie Mellon University who's committed, Chatham University that's committed. They also have the Community Foundation of Pittsburgh, who's working really hard to kind of bring those folks together. We've talked to a number of other cities about this. Austin, Seattle, Sacramento. San Jose has done some work on this. They don't really have like an epicenter. They have kind of what we've found, and this is somewhat anecdotal, but I would say there's a lot of interest often from academics where there's not interest from the city or the city government. And so that can work, but only so far. I really firmly believe that you have to have some sort of political buy-in and will to make this work. And so you need to have involvement of either kind of some sort of leading elected official, I think, to really have the city kind of embrace this holistically. It's not saying you can't do it, but I think it helps. And so even in Houston, it's a little more Rice University than it is Mayor Turner's office, but they're starting to come around on that. And so I think we've seen that in San Jose, where like you have a lot of engagement from Stanford, but not as much. And the city's been engaged on climate stuff, but not as much on the SDGs. So yeah, that's what I'm saying. Internationally, it's much bigger.
Yeah. Another question. Do we have time? I'm asking, my second question is about goal number 17.
Mm-hmm.
We have done some studies of that, and then I think Mr. Ayaleli here asked a very good question also about partnership. Antonio Gutierrez, the UN Secretary General, published an op-ed in Financial Times last October, which said SDGs are seriously off track, right? That was the title of that. And we studied that, and I think we have a hypothesis that all 17 goals are equally important, but primus inter pares is goal number 17, which is a little bit more important than the others, because we call that it's an enabling or cost-cutting goal. It enables achievement or accomplishment of those goals. And she is working, so I and our student, on a concept of system of systems and applying for goal number 17 and others. My question is, to what extent you think goal number 17 is some sort of like a foundation, like an enabler and cross-cutting, and accomplishing that and getting that partnership systematically developed enables the other goals accomplished?
I think that's a great question. I tend not to think any goal is more important than the other, right? Like I'm a firm believer in the universality.
It's not politically correct to say that.
Yeah, I'm going to answer in 2 ways. Like the first way is I think that I think that the messaging that we get a lot around the goals is that we're not going to get there. We're $6 billion, $1 trillion behind, like we need this massive investment. And I think all of that is true. But I think if you're still looking at it from a global perspective in the aggregate, we've seen tremendous progress from 1995 through present on some of the huge indicators that were captured in the MDGs and the SDGs. I think we have tremendous progress still to be made. And if you want to look at it in the aggregate, there are folks like I'd point to John MacArthur at Brookings and Homi Karas who've written a book, and they're really big on this specific people, specific places thing. They'll point to, sorry?
Can you explain what you mean?
Sure. So like if you look at something like childhood mortality, under 5 mortality, you can point to, I think there are really 5 countries globally that have the hugest disparity. And I think of those 5, Nigeria has the bulk of the challenge. So if we wanted to look at it that way, we could put a ton of just concentrated energy and resources, and we should, into reducing childhood mortality in Nigeria. And you would make huge difference in terms of the goals. But I think the important part is to make sure that we're also, while we're making those huge strides, we're also broadening the shared agenda out to make sure that everybody's engaged in that conversation. And we get away from the paradigm that like, there's just the rest of the world is here to fix Nigeria, right? And it's about kind of trying to all collectively come together and fix our own communities in the process of also supporting each other. And that's where I wish the conversation around 17 would go. And I think we're trying to have that conversation. So I think the second part, my second answer to that is that I think 17 is really good. I think it's, particularly at the target level, there's a lot of assumptions built in that don't necessarily work if you're trying to do this other than as a nation state, right? So it's one of the goals that I would point to that's most difficult to localize. And that's ironic, I think, because here we're doing it, right? Like we are goal 17 every day when we're here at USC with all of our academic partners and our community partners. And the mayor's office has created this, kind of community of practice and this community of effort to try to bring the community together. That is goal 17. Right? And so as we create these additional vectors of mobilization around things like affordable housing, like that is goal 17 in practice. But I think as written, and I pulled it up so you could see, the measures and the indicators are difficult. They're not necessarily representative of how we would evaluate that type of mobilization. So I think that there's work to be done on this when we talk about making this a bigger tent type of goal. You can see here where we've used local language, right? Using public-private networks assist with implementation, but we can't really measure that. It's pretty qualitative. So I think 17, there's work to be done in terms of that particular goal. I think in some ways we're doing it, and then I think other ways there's like a conversation to be had about how to make that more real. So. Mm-hmm. Sure. So I think that's a great question. It's one that we talk about all the time. And one of the things that was interesting is when we first got the 6 cities together that are a part of this network, there was kind of an initial email that was like, we are inclusive as part of defining gender, right? So trans women are women, trans men are men, right? Everyone is part of this conversation. So that was a kind of initial precursor. One of the things that we mentioned, I talked about the kind of all girls, all children, all people, right? We initially built in a new target around ending discrimination, which you see here at 5X. We've internally debated whether that makes more sense as part of SDG 5 or more part as SDG 10 or both, right? 10 is about reduced inequalities. So where does that live? How do we measure it? And Angela's actually going to lead a project with Sophia this summer. Do you guys want to talk about the project?
So there's growing conversations on how LGBTQ plus inclusion can be added to the SDGs. It's never going to be adopted by the member states, right? 193 countries are not going to add this to the agenda, but being a city where it is an important topic, we can look at the literature that's out there. And Sophia's involved with all the international conversation going around there, but how do we bring it back to LA? And how can we be an example of a city on how we include conversations about not a lot of data out there, and because our platform is a data platform, at least this website, it's included in different places. So 5 has an indicator, 10 has a couple of indicators, SDG 4 has an indicator on how LGBTQA plus LGBTQA plus students feel safe in schools in LAUSD, which LAUSD started reporting that they do an annual survey of all their students, and now it's been a question that's added in there. So as we find indicators like that, we add them in here, and they're different places, because it doesn't, just as cities don't only work on SDG 11, LGBTQA plus population should be included in all of them, right? So as the data comes, we add them in different places, but this summer we're going to actually dive into it and think about what it means for everyone.
This is where I would say we really invite your input. The email sdg@lacity.org. You'll if you send it to that, you'll hit me, you'll hit Angela, you'll hit a couple other members of our team, and basically we want any sort of indicator that you can think of, right? Like if you think it's a good indicator and it's got a data source to back it up, send it to us. Like we'll put it on the site.
And for students that are interested in that particular project, just let us know.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
My name is Jessica. I'm a engineer here, and I have a question about urban oil protection here in LA.
Mm-hmm.
And about a third of LA residents live within a mile of an urban drilling site. So I wanted to ask if the city of LA is conducting any environmental impact reports or any other sort of assessment to identify gaps in SDG numbers 3 and 11.
Sure. So I can't speak to specifics because it's just not what I do, but we had a petroleum administrator in the city who's actually one of my neighbors. He's a great guy. I think now he's working at the state level for the governor and was appointed to that level. And one of the things he did was assess the kind of overall laydown of all of those petroleum sites. And we've started to talk about ways to remediate and repurpose those sites internally. I think that's an active conversation. I think particularly as we look at places to build new infrastructure around things like composting and recycling, those become particularly attractive sites for repurposing. But that's just an idea, don't quote me. And we'll see kind of where that goes. And there's a lot of information I'd point you to. The Board of Public Works in LA oversees all of the petroleum administration for the city, and they have some relatively recent reporting on that. I think as recent as like last summer, there were some big reports released. That's just where that's about as much as I know on that.
I was just asking because I know a lot of the urban drilling sites disproportionately affect people of color and low-income communities. A lot of them aren't seeing that information.
100%. And we also have, we consider kind of the SDGs as they are not, we did not create like a report in and of itself. What we did was report on things the city's already doing. And so 2 of those principal reports I mentioned in the context of other cities. One is our Green New Deal, which is our sustainability plan. It was released in April of 2019. And equity is the central lens throughout all of the all the chapters, and there are 9 chapters of the Green New Deal. And there is particular initiatives around EJ issues, around environmental justice issues. And that's also called out and it's all mapped to the SDGs, by the way, at the target level, that whole Green New Deal. So if you go to plan.lamayor.org, I can go there right now, you can see that all of those initiatives as well. And then what we're planning to do in working with our sustainability team is actually pull their metrics and measures into our reporting platform as they become available. But again, like we're less than a year into that plan, so.
So with that, thank you, Erin. Will you all join me in thanking Erin?
Every clap.